So the pre-reading for this session was chapter 2 from Making Every Maths Lesson Count. There is a huge amount of information in this chapter. I found it really interesting. Some of it I'd seen before, said sometimes in a slightly different way, but ultimately the same thing. And I think any maths teacher that reads that chapter, I don't know anyone that does all of it, and I don't really know anyone that couldn't take an idea from it. But there is a lot of information in there. So be careful that you do take the idea that works in your context with your students. But you must have read that chapter before continuing with the video. One of the other things I want you to remember is when we've done mastery training in the work groups, we often get a lot of requests about representations and manipulatives because 2, 3, 5 years ago, that was the thing that was new to a lot of us. But what we do need to remember is how they link into everything else. The worked examples, and the chapter really points that out because it has a whole section on representations. But we have to link all of this stuff together. We have to link the variation with the representations, with the worked examples, putting it all together because that's where the coherence comes from. I've found a lot of people find the coherence quite difficult to define and give examples of, but it is really just putting everything, all of these things together, which there's loads of examples of in that chapter. And I think when we're thinking about these things, we've got to remember it's not necessarily just the worked examples that we're thinking about. We've got to put everything we've done together. We've got to put the variation that we've thought about along with the representations. And it's things like this question, being in this short exercise, which is designed for after students have learnt a topic for them to be able to go and do sort of some different examples to check that they can do each skills. And I did this today. One of the students, when it was a negative answer, just said, but you can't have negative fractions. And the minute she said it, I sort of said, but why not? And you could see that thought process, you could see that thinking, and it was really nice to see that. And it's can we get these kind of things that make the students think about different scenarios, different things? Can we get them into worked examples? And can we get the same ideas that I put in this chapter, can we get them into the practice as well? Now, attached to the email, there's also a sheet that I'd like you to fill in. And these 3 things, what I'd like you to say with these is when was the last time you either thought about or used one of these things in your examples or in a resource? And I just want to speak a little bit more about them because there's a couple of things that made me think. The first one, isolate the skill. I've done this specifically for 2 topics and actually it worked really well. It did make me think outside the box. I couldn't really do it until I had to talk it through with somebody. I couldn't have isolated the skills on my own. Talking it through really made me think carefully about it. Sometimes you might hear this called atomization. I've also seen it taken too far. Somebody isolated the skills used in simultaneous equations and they got something ridiculous like 27 different skills, taking it a little bit too far. So if you hear or see this elsewhere, that it's atomization, and I find it really interesting, it's really good, and be aware it's out there in other areas as well. In terms of the worked examples, the one that jumps out to me is the bottom one, the strategy comparison. I've done that in the mastery training with the maths hubs, and it is something that led me to do that more in lessons, particularly when students come up with different strategies. There's not one that's better than the other sometimes, and I talk about efficiency. But thinking of those 4 types of worked examples, when have you last used one of them, either in an example that you present or within a resource, questions within a resource? And the final one, I'm just going to show you an example of this that I use, concept to non-concept, and quite often I think this is called example, non-example. And here's a way that I've used it quite often. Here's an example of one I've used this week. I taught equality and equivalence from the White Rose Scheme of Learning to Year 7, and it was a lower retaining group, and I went through this Freya model. And Freya models is where I generally use the example and the non-example. This is another example. This is one I've used when I've been teaching Pythagoras. This kind of links to the isolating the skill as well. It's to teach Pythagoras, it's really important that they can identify the hypotenuse on a triangle and then variation comes in because you've got to have the triangles different ways round. So it kind of links all those 3 together. And to be honest, a lot of what I'm talking about, I feel like it's to do with coherence because it's linking all those variation, isolating the skill, example, non-example. It's linking sameness, difference, linking all those things together. So it's about coherence. If you do those things within a particular topic, that's where you'll find the coherence comes. I use example, non-examples mostly in Freya models, and I have lots. If you'd like me to share them, I'm happy to do that. So what I'd like you to do now is pause the video, have a look at the document I've sent, and just for these things, just be honest and have a think about when you last used these, whether you've ever used them, and whether it's something you think, actually, I think that's quite a good idea, I could use it more. With none of them am I suggesting that we should use them all the time and things like that. It's what suits you in your context with your students. What do you think would help, or what would you like to try? Pause the video now and fill in that section of the worksheet. Now the next part of the chapter talks about all of these different things. And they're not necessarily about your worked example specifically, they're more about the way you deliver it or the representations you used to support your delivery. So what I would like you to do with this bit is to just go through each one, and they're all in the chapter if you want to recap any of them, and just have a think about whether this is something you've consciously thought about, whether it's something you think you need to consciously thought about because it might be something you can improve, whether it's something you quite naturally do, some of us do, whether it's something that you've built into your habits quite well, and just have a little bit of a reflect about each one and have a think about whether it's something you could consciously work on. We've just done some CPD whole school about habits. And the context I want you to think about these in is, if I tweaked one of these things ever so slightly, what kind of bigger, longer impact would that have if the students in front of me are getting that change every lesson for the next however many months that you'll teach them, whether it's just this academic year or beyond that? Because if you can tweak just one of these in a really small way, actually could have a huge impact on the effectiveness of your teaching and the effectiveness of their learning. So it's really important to think about this, including the non-verbal things that we do when we're teaching. So really, and the other thing is some people find reflection really easy, some people really struggle to reflect. So really do try and be honest and think about it. Fill in the worksheet, this section of the worksheet now. Now at the end of the chapter, there's a selection of reflective questions. Now I think if you did all of them, by the time you got to the sort of fifth one, you'd forgotten what you thought about on the first one. So what I want you to do now is choose just a couple that you think, perhaps you think, I can do that, I can reflect on that, that you think you can reflect on and make a change with. Choose a couple that you think are really useful to you, and please write those ones down on your sheet and write what you're reflecting about. So choose two that you think will help you to reflect on, write them down on the sheet and write down your reflections. Pause the video now to write down those things. What I'd like you to do next is a bit of planning about what are you going to do next from this, and I'm going to give you a couple of ideas. What I'd like you to think about now is what you're going to do next. I'd like to think about how you could introduce one idea for your department to try. So you might decide there is one that you don't see very much at all, and actually if you put that idea into a few different topics and present that, then that gives them a lot of options to give it a go. You might decide that actually you think there's 3 different things, 4 different things that you really think the department would benefit from trying, because some of them might already do some of them. In that scenario, you might want to show them 4 different examples, but within the same topic, and they can then choose which one they're going to try in an upcoming topic in the future. I would say get them to just try one thing. I think it's easier to try one thing and reflect on it. When you're asked to try more than one, it can sometimes get diluted or lost. So however you want to do it, try and get people to try one idea. As part of doing that, you could identify a topic within each year group that's coming up soon where the type of worked example you want to use could be effective. So by giving that context, it might help members of your department and colleagues. They might just take the one you've got. If you think you'll find people that will struggle to come up with a version themselves, you could give them that version to use. to see if they thought it worked a bit better than your bog standard example. Here's how you do something. So now you've got some time to do what I've just asked you to do, or to plan what I've just asked you to do. Within all of this, like I always say, you've got to do what's right for your students, your context. Take something from that chapter and do something with it. And try and plant it as a seed, whether you're planting it with others, when you're putting it into one topic, 2 topics. Go off and do something with some of the ideas from that chapter. There's so many in there. I do think you need to hone in on 1 or 2 things that you think you could work on. There is a link to a Padlet in your email. What I'd like you to do when you've done a bit of planning and go to the Padlet and just explain to me what is it you're going to do. You're making a commitment to do something. You're making a commitment to take action and to try and share some of the stuff that we've learnt today. If you could go to the link in the email, there's lots of information in that email. If you just make sure you've covered all of that and fill in that Padlet, that just kind of signals to me that you've got to the end of the session and you have completed this session. Put your name, if you're adding to the Padlet, just put your school or your name, just so I know who's contributed. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry that this training has been delivered in this form. It's, I think, just the needs of the situation at the moment. Sue Bennett will be in contact about the next session, and if you do send any communication to me, please could you CC Sue Bennett in. She's been CC'd into the email that you've received today, so you've got her email address. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you found something useful. Your gap task is to deliver the commitment that you said you were going to do. Try something out, share it with your department, try and get people thinking about that coherence and bringing everything together by using some of the stuff that we've talked about today. Thank you.